The rain hammered against the windshield of Officer Martinez's patrol car as she pulled up to the intersection of Maple and 3rd, her headlights cutting through the November darkness to illuminate a scene that would haunt her for months to come. Steam rose from the crumpled hood of a silver Honda Civic, its driver's side door hanging open like a broken wing. 20 feet away, a black Mercedes sedan sat pristine and untouched, its hazard lights blinking in perfect rhythm, while 3 figures in expensive coats stood beside it, their voices carrying over the sound of sirens approaching from the distance. "She came out of nowhere," the woman in the Chanel coat was saying, her manicured finger pointing accusingly at the Honda. "My daughter swerved to avoid her, but that girl, she was driving recklessly, probably on her phone. She caused this whole mess." Officer Martinez stepped out into the cold rain, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the red and blue emergency lights now flooding the intersection. She'd been a traffic officer for 8 years, long enough to read the invisible currents that flowed beneath every accident scene, the way guilt and fear and desperation could twist a story before the first witness statement was even taken. Something about this scene felt wrong, too choreographed, too perfectly arranged. The damaged Honda belonged to Maya Chen, a 23-year-old nursing student who worked double shifts at Mercy General Hospital to pay for her education and support her younger sister. Maya sat in the back of an ambulance now, a butterfly bandage on her forehead and shock glazing her dark eyes as EMT Sarah Rodriguez checked her pupils with a penlight. I don't understand," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I had the green light. I know I had the green light. I was going to pick up my sister from her violin lesson, and I always take this route, and I know this intersection like the back of my hand." Sarah Rodriguez had been an EMT for 12 years, and she'd learned to listen not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. Maya's vital signs were stable, her injuries minor, but there was something in the young woman's voice, a certainty that cut through the confusion and trauma that made Sarah pause. She glanced toward the Mercedes, where the family was now speaking animatedly to the first responding officers, their gestures broad and confident. The Mercedes family consisted of Victoria Ashford, a prominent real estate developer whose face regularly appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper. Her daughter Chloe, a 21-year-old business major at the State University, and Victoria's husband Robert, a corporate lawyer whose firm represented half the city's wealthiest families. They stood in a tight formation beside their undamaged car, their stories aligning with the precision of a practiced performance. The light had just turned yellow when Chloe entered the intersection, Robert was explaining to Officer Martinez, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he typically reserved for closing arguments. "She was driving responsibly, within the speed limit, when this girl ran the red light and slammed into us. It's a miracle Chloe wasn't seriously injured." But Officer Martinez had noticed something that nagged at her trained eye. The angle of the damage on Maya's Honda didn't match the story being told. The impact pattern suggested a side collision, not a head-on crash. She made a note to request the traffic camera footage from the intersection, though she knew it would take days to process through the bureaucratic maze of city departments. Meanwhile, Dr. James Park, the emergency room physician who would later treat Maya's injuries, was finishing his shift at Mercy General when he heard about the accident over the hospital's radio system. Maya Chen was one of his favorite nursing students, intelligent, compassionate, and impossibly dedicated to her patients despite working exhausting hours to make ends meet. He'd watched her comfort dying patients with the same gentle attention she gave to crying children, and he'd written her letters of recommendation that praised not just her clinical skills, but her unwavering integrity. The intersection of Maple and 3rd had been the site of 14 accidents in the past 3 years, a statistic that city traffic engineer Linda Walsh had been trying to address through a series of proposed safety improvements that kept getting buried in budget meetings and political maneuvering. The traffic light had been installed in 1987 and operated on an outdated timing system that created dangerous gaps in the light cycles, but the cost of upgrading to a modern smart system had been deemed too expensive by the city council. Linda had driven through this intersection twice a day for the past 5 years on her way to and from work, and she knew its rhythms like a familiar song. The light stayed yellow for exactly 3.2 seconds before turning red, barely enough time for a car traveling the speed limit to clear the intersection safely. She'd submitted 3 separate reports recommending immediate improvements, each one signed and stamped with her professional seal, each one filed away in some forgotten government folder. As Officer Martinez continued taking statements, Maya's 15-year-old sister Jessica arrived at the scene, having been dropped off by her violin teacher, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who taught music in the community for over 40 years. Jessica's violin case was still clutched in her small hands as she ran toward the ambulance, her school uniform soaked through by the November rain. "Maya, Maya, are you okay?" Jessica's voice cracked with fear as she reached for her sister's hand. Maya had been more than a sister to Jessica since their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. She'd been mother, father, provider, and protector, all rolled into one exhausted 23-year-old who never complained about the sacrifices she made daily. Mrs. Patterson stood at a respectful distance, but her sharp eyes took in every detail of the scene with the observational skills that came from decades of teaching children and reading between the lines of family dynamics. She'd known the Chen sisters since Jessica started violin lessons 2 years ago, always paying with carefully counted bills that Maya earned through her hospital shifts. Mrs. Patterson had offered to reduce the lesson fees more than once, but Maya had politely declined, insisting on paying full price with the quiet dignity that characterized everything she did. The Ashford family's insurance representative, David Mitchell, arrived within 30 minutes of the accident, an unusually fast response time that spoke to the family's influence and the size of their premiums. David was a 20-year veteran of insurance investigations, who'd learned to spot fraud patterns and coached testimony, but he was also under pressure to maintain good relationships with high-value clients like the Ashfords, whose multiple properties and vehicles generated substantial revenue for his company. As the rain continued to fall, turning the accident scene into an impressionistic blur of lights and shadows, the 2 versions of truth began to crystallize into official statements. The Ashford family story was clear, consistent, and delivered with the confidence that came from knowing their word had weight in this community. Maya's version was quieter, hesitant, undermined by shock and the natural self-doubt that follows any traumatic event. But hidden in the Mercedes, tucked behind the rearview mirror where Chloe had installed it 6 months earlier after a minor parking lot incident, a small dashcam continued recording everything: the conversation before the police arrived, the coordination of stories, the moments of unguarded truth that would eventually unravel everything they'd carefully constructed. The camera's memory card held 90 minutes of footage, and in 17 minutes and 34 seconds of that recording lay the evidence that would expose a web of deception reaching far beyond a simple traffic accident. Officer Martinez finished collecting the initial statements as the tow trucks arrived to clear the vehicles. Maya's Honda would be totaled, she noted, the 23-year-old's primary means of transportation destroyed, along with her ability to get to work and school and her sister's violin lessons. The Mercedes, meanwhile, would need only minor bodywork, a few $100s of repairs that wouldn't even register on the Ashford family's insurance premiums. As the ambulance pulled away with Maya and Jessica inside, and the Ashford family climbed into their second car, a gleaming BMW that Robert had driven to the scene, Officer Martinez stood alone in the rain, studying her notes and trying to reconcile the nagging feeling that something fundamental had been misrepresented in the past hour. She didn't yet know about the dashcam, didn't yet understand that she was looking at the opening act of a conspiracy that would eventually involve insurance fraud, witness tampering, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of the local power structure. The intersection of Maple and 3rd returned to its normal rhythm. As the emergency vehicles departed, the broken glass swept away by city workers, the skid marks that might have told a different story already being washed clean by the relentless November rain. But the truth had been captured in digital format, preserved in ones and zeros on a memory card that would soon become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would divide the community and challenge everything people thought they knew about justice, power, and the price of standing up for what's right. In the days that followed, Maya Chen would discover that being right wasn't enough when you were fighting people who had spent decades learning how to make wrong look right. She would learn that truth was often just another commodity in a marketplace where money could buy not just silence, but the very appearance of justice itself. And she would find out that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to accept blame for something you didn't do, especially when powerful people need someone to blame. The rain continued to fall on Maple and Third, washing away the last physical evidence of what had happened there, but unable to cleanse the digital memory of a small camera that had witnessed everything. A camera that would eventually prove that sometimes the most important witness to injustice is the one nobody remembers is watching. Maya Chen's alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., the same time it had buzzed every morning for the past 3 years since she'd taken responsibility for Jessica and their small apartment on the east side of town. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television playing Spanish soap operas next door, and the radiator clanked with the irregular rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Maya rolled out of bed carefully, her body still aching from the accident 2 weeks ago, and padded barefoot to the kitchen to start the coffee that would fuel the next 18 hours of her life. Their apartment was a study in careful economics. Every piece of furniture purchased secondhand or inherited, every decorative touch chosen for its practicality rather than its beauty. The kitchen table had belonged to their grandmother and bore the ring stains of 40 years of family meals. The couch came from a thrift store and was covered with a throw blanket that hid the worst of the wear patterns. But Maya had hung cheerful yellow curtains in the windows and kept plants on the windowsills, small touches that transformed the space into something that felt like home rather than simply shelter. Jessica emerged from their shared bedroom at 5:15, her school uniform pressed and her violin case already packed for the day ahead. At 15, she possessed a quiet maturity that came from understanding exactly what her sister sacrificed to keep their small family afloat. She never asked for things they couldn't afford, never complained about the hand-me-down clothes or the generic cereal, never mentioned that her friends' families took vacations and bought new cars, and seemed to move through the world without the constant calculation of costs that governed every decision in the Chen household. "How's your head feeling this morning?" Jessica asked, studying Maya's face for signs of the headaches that had been plaguing her since the accident. The butterfly bandage had been removed, leaving only a small scar above Maya's left eyebrow, but the emotional toll of the crash seemed to linger in ways that concerned Jessica more than the physical injuries. "Better," Maya lied. The same way she lied about having enough to eat when groceries ran low at the end of the month, the same way she lied about not being tired when she'd worked a double shift at the hospital, followed by 4 hours of studying for her nursing boards. Maya had become an expert in small deceptions designed to protect Jessica from worry, though she suspected her sister saw through most of them. Their morning routine was choreographed by necessity. Maya dropped Jessica at school by 6:45, then drove to Mercy General Hospital in the used Toyota Camry she'd bought with her insurance settlement from their parents' accident. The Camry had 180,000 miles on it and a tendency to overheat in summer, but it was a reliable transportation that she'd been able to afford without taking on debt that would have made their financial situation even more precarious. At the hospital, Maya changed into scrubs that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to a soft gray, and began her shift in the medical surgical unit where she worked under the supervision of registered nurse Patricia Williams. Patricia was a 25-year veteran of hospital nursing who had initially been skeptical of Maya's quiet intensity, but had come to respect the young woman's instinctive understanding of patient care and her ability to anticipate needs before they became crises. "You're moving differently today," Patricia observed, as Maya checked medication schedules for their assigned patients. "Still hurting from that accident?" Maya had told Patricia and the other staff about the crash, though she kept the details vague. A traffic accident, some confusion about fault, insurance issues that would hopefully resolve themselves. She hadn't mentioned the growing pressure she was feeling from the Ashford family's insurance company, or the letters from their attorney that arrived with increasing frequency, each one more insistent that she accept responsibility for the accident and agree to cover their vehicle repairs and medical expenses. "I'm fine," Maya said, the same automatic response she gave to most expressions of concern. She learned early in life that people could only help you so much before your problems became burdens they couldn't carry, and she was determined to never be anyone's burden. Her first patient of the day was Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, an 84-year-old woman recovering from hip replacement surgery who had been in the hospital for 6 days. Mrs. Hartman had no family visitors and seemed to exist in a bubble of loneliness that reminded Maya of her own isolation, though she would never have admitted the comparison. Maya took extra time with Mrs. Hartman's care, helping her walk the hallways and listening to stories about the woman's late husband and the garden they'd tended together for 40 years. "You have gentle hands," Mrs. Hartman told Maya as she helped her settle back into bed after physical therapy. "And sad eyes. What's troubling you, dear?" Maya was surprised by the directness of the question. Most people didn't look closely enough to see past her professional competence to the worry that had been gnawing at her for weeks. The accident had shaken something loose in Maya's carefully constructed world, and she was struggling to hold everything together while dealing with insurance investigators and conflicting police reports and the growing suspicion that she was being blamed for something that wasn't her fault. "Just tired," Maya said, but Mrs. Hartman's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled by the deflection. During her lunch break, Maya sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and called Jessica's school to confirm that her sister had been marked present in all her classes. It was a daily ritual, born from the fear that had lived in Maya's chest since the day Child Protective Services had conducted their initial home visit 3 years ago, assessing whether a 20-year-old college student could adequately care for her teenage sister. Maya had passed their evaluation, but the memory of that uncertainty had left her hyper-vigilant about maintaining perfect records of responsibility. The afternoon brought new challenges when Dr. Mitchell from the insurance company called Maya's cell phone during her break, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Miss Chen, I've reviewed the police report from your accident, and I'm afraid our investigation has determined that you were at fault for the collision. We'll need you to contact your insurance company to arrange payment for the damages to the Ashford vehicle, as well as compensation for their medical expenses and pain and suffering." "I don't understand," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I had the green light. I'm sure I had the green light." "Unfortunately, the witness statements all corroborate that the Ashford vehicle had the right of way," Dr. Mitchell replied with the tone of someone closing a case file. "I understand this is difficult, but accepting responsibility now will help us resolve this matter quickly and minimize additional legal complications." After the call ended, Maya sat in her car and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation, the crushing possibility that she might lose everything she'd worked to build, that Jessica might end up in foster care, that 3 years of careful planning and sacrifice might be wiped away by an accident that she knew in her heart hadn't been her fault. Then she dried her eyes, returned to work, and finished her shift with the same professional competence her patients had come to expect. That evening, Maya attended her nursing school study group in the basement of the public library, where she and 5 other students reviewed pharmacology and pathophysiology with the intensity of people who understood that their future careers hung in the balance of their upcoming licensing exams. Maya had always been one of the strongest students in the group, but tonight her concentration was fractured by anxiety and the growing realization that she might not be able to afford to continue her education if the insurance settlement went against her. Her study partner, Carlos Martinez, noticed her distraction during their review of cardiac medications. Carlos was a former EMT who'd returned to school to become a nurse practitioner, and he possessed the observational skills that came from years of reading people in crisis situations. "You okay, Maya? You seem pretty stressed tonight."
Maya found herself telling Carlos about the accident, describing the confusion she felt about the conflicting accounts of what had happened. Carlos listened with the focused attention of someone who'd responded to hundreds of traffic accidents and understood the complex dynamics that surrounded them. "Have you seen the police report?" he asked. "Sometimes there are details in the official documentation that can help clarify these situations." Maya hadn't requested a copy of the police report, though she realized now that she should have done so weeks ago. The oversight felt like another failure in judgment, another way she'd been naive about protecting herself in a system that seemed designed to favor people with more experience navigating its complexities. After study group, Maya drove home through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, past the small houses and apartment buildings where other families were settling in for the evening. She envied their presumed security, the way they could probably sleep without calculating utility bills or wondering whether their insurance would cover unexpected emergencies. Maya had never known that kind of financial peace, but she thought she was building toward it through her education and career plans. Now those plans felt precarious, threatened by forces she didn't fully understand. At home, Jessica was practicing violin in their bedroom, her bow moving across the strings with the precision that came from 2 years of dedicated study. Maya stood in the doorway, listening to a Bach piece that Mrs. Patterson had assigned for an upcoming recital, and felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with protectiveness. Jessica had inherited their mother's musical talent and their father's quiet determination, and Maya was determined to provide her with opportunities that their own parents' early death had cut short. "How was work today?" Jessica asked when she finished the piece. "Fine," Maya said, another small lie added to the collection she maintained to shield her sister from adult worries. "How was your day?" Jessica launched into a description of her history test and drama club rehearsal, the normal teenage concerns that Maya treasured, because they represented the childhood she was trying to preserve for her sister. Maya made dinner while listening to Jessica's stories. Spaghetti with marinara sauce from a jar, supplemented with frozen vegetables and day-old bread from the bakery outlet where she shopped to stretch their grocery budget. After dinner, Maya sped her nursing textbooks across the kitchen table and tried to focus on studying for her upcoming exam on maternal child nursing. The material should have been interesting. She'd always been drawn to pediatric care. But tonight, the words seemed to blur together on the page. She found herself reading the same paragraph multiple times, her mind drifting to insurance settlements and witness statements, and the growing possibility that her careful plans might be derailing through no fault of her own.
At 11 p.m., Maya closed her books and checked the locks on their apartment door, a nightly ritual that represented her assumption of the parental responsibilities that had fallen to her by default. She looked in on Jessica, who had fallen asleep with a book open on her chest, and carefully removed it without waking her sister. Then Maya settled onto the couch that served as her bed, pulling the throw blanket up to her chin and trying to quiet her racing thoughts enough to sleep. But sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by dreams of traffic lights and twisted metal, and the sound of expensive voices explaining why she was responsible for things she knew she hadn't done. Maya woke several times during the night, each time feeling the weight of problems that seemed to grow larger in the darkness, challenges that threatened not just her own future, but the security of the only family she had left. In the morning, her alarm would buzz at 4:30 a.m. again, and Maya would begin another day of careful balance, providing care for her patients while fighting for her own survival, protecting Jessica from worry while struggling with fears she couldn't fully voice, maintaining hope for a better future while confronting the possibility that everything she'd worked toward might be slipping away through circumstances beyond her control. She was 23 years old and carried responsibilities that would have challenged someone twice her age, but she faced them with the quiet determination that had sustained her through 3 years of grief and struggle and the daily miracle of keeping her small family intact. The first lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to Maya's apartment while she was at the hospital. Jessica signed for it with the careful signature that Maya had taught her to use for important documents, though neither of them had expected something that would fundamentally change the trajectory of their lives. The envelope bore the letterhead of Ashford and Associates,
Robert Ashford's own firm, and contained a formal demand for $45,000 in damages, medical expenses, and compensation for pain and suffering, resulting from what they termed Maya's reckless and negligent operation of a motor vehicle. Maya read the letter 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table with Jessica watching anxiously from across the room. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of references to statutes and precedents that Maya didn't understand, but the essential message was clear. The Ashford family was holding her responsible for an accident that had caused minimal damage to their Mercedes and no visible injuries to any of them. The amount they were demanding represented more than Maya earned in an entire year, even working double shifts at the hospital. "What does it mean?" Jessica asked, her violin practice forgotten as she watched Maya's face pale with each paragraph. "It means they want me to pay them money," Maya said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "A lot of money. For the accident." Jessica had been in the car with Maya enough times to know her sister's driving habits, careful to the point of being overly cautious, always checking mirrors twice, never speeding or taking risks that might jeopardize their only reliable transportation. The idea that Maya had caused an accident through reckless driving struck her as fundamentally impossible, but she was beginning to understand possibility and truth didn't always align in the adult world. Maya called her insurance company the next morning during her break at the hospital, sitting in the parking lot with the legal letter spread across her steering wheel. The claims adjuster, Sandra Walsh, delivered the news with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone who'd explained similar situations hundreds of times before. "Ms. Chen, based on the police report and witness statements, our investigation has determined that you were at fault for this accident. Unfortunately, your policy only covers $25,000 in liability damages, which leaves you personally responsible for the remaining $20,000 that the Ashford family is claiming." Maya felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the same disorientation she'd experienced when the social worker had explained the requirements for maintaining custody of Jessica 3 years ago. The adult world was full of systems and rules that seemed designed to favor people who already had advantages, and Maya was once again finding herself on the wrong side of those calculations. "But I had the green light," Maya insisted. "I'm certain I had the green light."
"I understand your concern," Sandra replied with practiced sympathy, "but the evidence doesn't support your recollection of events. The Ashford family has multiple witnesses who confirm that their daughter had the right-of-way when you entered the intersection." After ending the call, Maya sat in her car and tried to process the reality of her situation. $20,000 might as well have been $20 million. It was money she didn't have and couldn't reasonably expect to earn while continuing her nursing education and supporting Jessica. The bankruptcy she'd worked so hard to avoid after their parents' death was suddenly looming again, and with it the possibility that Child Protective Services might reconsider their arrangement if Maya's financial situation became untenable. The second escalation came when Maya attempted to request a copy of the police report from Officer Martinez, hoping to find some detail that might clarify the confusion about the accident. Officer Martinez was professional but distant when Maya called the police department, her tone suggesting that she'd already moved on to other cases and other concerns. "Ms. Chen, the report is a matter of public record, but I should warn you that it clearly indicates you were at fault for the collision. The witness statements are consistent, and the physical evidence supports their account of events." When Maya finally obtained a copy of the report, she discovered that the multiple witnesses Sandra had mentioned were actually just the 3 members of the Ashford family: Victoria, Robert, and Chloe, plus one additional person identified as James Morrison, who claimed to have seen the accident from the parking lot of a nearby coffee shop. Maya didn't remember seeing anyone else at the scene that night, but the police report treated Morrison's statement as corroborating evidence that sealed her responsibility for the crash.
Maya decided to visit the coffee shop where James Morrison claimed to have witnessed the accident, a small, independent cafe called the Daily Grind that sat on the corner opposite the intersection. The owner, Maria Santos, was a friendly woman in her 50s who knew most of her regular customers by name and remembered details about their usual orders and personal lives. When Maya described the night of the accident and asked about James Morrison, Maria's expression grew puzzled. November 15th, Maria repeated, checking her calendar and receipts from that evening. We close at 6 p.m. on weekdays, and it gets dark so early in November. There wouldn't have been anyone in our parking lot at 7:30 when you said your accident happened. This information hit Maya like a physical blow, the first concrete evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the official account of her accident. If the coffee shop was closed, how could James Morrison have witnessed anything from their parking lot? Maya asked Maria if she remembered anyone named Morrison as a customer, but the name didn't ring any bells. I've been running this place for 8 years, and I know most of our regulars pretty well. I've never heard that name before. Maya left the Daily Grind with her first real hope that she might be able to challenge the narrative that had been constructed around her accident. But she also felt the weight of taking on a fight for which she was completely unprepared. She had no experience with legal battles or insurance fraud investigations, no money to hire an attorney, and no clear understanding of how to navigate the systems that seemed designed to favor people with more resources and connections than she possessed. The third escalation occurred when Maya attempted to discuss the discrepancy about the witness with her own insurance company. Sandra Walsh listened to Maya's explanation about the Daily Grind being closed, but her response suggested that Maya was grasping at straws rather than uncovering important evidence. Miss Chen, I understand you're looking for ways to dispute the findings, but the police investigation was thorough, and we have to base our decisions on the official report. If you believe there were errors in the investigation, you would need to take that up with the police department or hire your own attorney to challenge their conclusions. Maya realized that Sandra Walsh wasn't really advocating for her as a customer. She was protecting the insurance company's interests by accepting the path of least resistance, which meant acknowledging Maya's fault and paying out the minimum amount required by her policy. The remaining $20,000 that the Ashfords were demanding would be Maya's problem to solve, not the insurance company's concern.
The fourth escalation came in the form of a phone call from Robert Ashford himself, delivered to Maya's cell phone during her shift at the hospital. Maya had to step into an empty patient room to take the call, her hands shaking as she recognized the commanding voice she'd heard at the accident scene. Miss Chen, I'm calling as a courtesy to let you know that my family has been more than patient in waiting for you to accept responsibility for this incident. If we don't receive a settlement agreement within the next 2 weeks, we'll be forced to file a lawsuit against you personally. Robert's voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as final statements rather than opening negotiations. He explained that a lawsuit would result in additional legal fees and court costs that would be added to the damages Maya would eventually be required to pay, potentially doubling or tripling the amount she owed. I understand you're a young woman trying to make her way in the world, Robert continued with what sounded like scripted sympathy, and I don't want to see you destroy your future over pride or stubbornness. Accept responsibility now, and we can resolve this matter quietly, without ruining your credit or affecting your ability to continue your education. After the call ended, Maya stood in the empty hospital room and felt the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in around her. Robert Ashford was offering her a choice between bankruptcy now and bankruptcy later, between accepting blame for something she hadn't done and fighting a legal battle she couldn't afford to win. Neither option preserved the stability she'd worked so hard to build for Jessica and herself. The fifth escalation occurred when Maya confided her situation to Dr. James Park during one of their usual conversations about patient care and nursing school preparation. Dr. Park had become something of a mentor to Maya over the past 2 years, recognizing her natural aptitude for medical care and her dedication to learning. But he'd never seen her looking as defeated as she did that afternoon. Maya, you've been distracted for weeks now, he observed as they reviewed medication charts together. "What's going on?" Maya found herself telling Dr. Park the whole story: the accident, the conflicting accounts, the mysterious witness who might not have existed, the financial pressure that threatened to end her nursing education. Dr. Park listened with the focused attention he gave to complex medical diagnoses, asking clarifying questions and taking notes on a legal pad. "This doesn't sound like a simple traffic accident," he said when Maya finished her account. "It sounds like someone is trying to defraud you and possibly your insurance company as well." Dr. Park's assessment gave Maya the first external validation that her instincts about the accident had been correct, but it also highlighted how unprepared she was to challenge people with the resources and experience of the Ashford family. Dr. Park offered to help her find a lawyer who might take her case on a contingency basis, but Maya worried about the implications of escalating the conflict when she had so much to lose and so little to gain. The sixth escalation happened at Jessica's school, where Maya was called in for a conference with the guidance counselor, Mrs. Ellen Foster. Mrs. Foster had noticed that Jessica's grades were slipping and that she seemed distracted during classes, often staring out the window instead of participating in discussions. When Mrs. Foster asked Jessica about problems at home, the 15-year-old had finally broken down and told her about Maya's accident and the legal troubles that were consuming their household. "I'm worried about both of you," Mrs. Foster told Maya during their conference. "Jessica is obviously stressed about your situation, and she's mentioned concerns about having to move if you can't afford your apartment anymore." Maya realized that despite her efforts to shield Jessica from the worst of their problems, her sister was absorbing the anxiety that filled their small apartment like smoke from an unseen fire. Jessica had always been perceptive about adult concerns, and the strain of the past month was showing in her schoolwork and her increasingly quiet demeanor at home. The seventh escalation occurred when Maya's nursing school advisor, Professor Catherine Williams, called her into her office to discuss Maya's recent performance in clinical rotations. Maya's usual competence and confidence had been replaced by a distracted anxiety that was affecting her patient care and her ability to focus during critical procedures.
"Maya, you're one of our strongest students, but something is obviously troubling you," Professor Williams said with the direct concern that had made her an effective educator for 15 years. "If there are personal issues that are interfering with your studies, we need to address them before they affect your ability to pass your licensing examination." Maya explained her situation to Professor Williams, who listened with growing indignation as the details emerged. Professor Williams had spent her career working with nursing students who often face significant personal challenges while pursuing their education. But Maya's case struck her as particularly unjust, a promising student being sabotaged by people who seemed to view her as an easy target for their schemes. "This is outrageous," Professor Williams said when Maya finished her account. "Someone needs to investigate what really happened at that intersection, and it's not going to be the people who have already decided you're guilty." The eighth and final escalation in this phase of Maya's ordeal, when she received a second letter from Ashford and Associates, this one informing her that the family had filed a lawsuit against her in civil court. The court papers were even more intimidating than the initial demand letter, filled with formal legal language that made Maya's alleged offenses sound like serious crimes rather than a disputed traffic accident. Maya sat at her kitchen table reading the lawsuit papers while Jessica practiced violin in their bedroom, the beautiful music providing an ironic soundtrack to the destruction of everything Maya had worked to build. The lawsuit demanded not just the original $45,000, but an additional $15,000 in punitive damages and legal fees, plus interest that would continue to accumulate until the matter was resolved. As Maya read through the legal documents, she realized that the Ashford family had constructed a comprehensive narrative that painted her as a reckless young driver who had endangered their lives through negligent behavior. The lawsuit claimed that Chloe Ashford was suffering from ongoing anxiety and depression as a result of the accident, and that Victoria Ashford had developed chronic neck pain that interfered with her ability to conduct her real estate business. The irony was devastating. Maya, who had dedicated her adult life to caring for others and taking responsibility for everyone around her, was being portrayed as someone who refused to acknowledge the harm she had caused to innocent people. The gap between her actual character and the person described in the lawsuit felt like a form of identity theft, a systematic erasure of who she actually was in favor of a version that served someone else's financial interests. That evening, Maya called Mrs. Patterson, Jessica's violin teacher, and explained that they might need to suspend the lessons temporarily due to financial constraints. Mrs. Patterson listened to Maya's carefully edited explanation, focusing on unexpected expenses rather than the full scope of the legal battle, and responded with the gentle firmness that had made her an effective teacher for 40 years. "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson said. "Jessica is preparing for the spring recital, and I won't have her musical education interrupted by temporary difficulties. We'll work out the payment details later, after your situation resolves itself." Mrs. Patterson's kindness was both a gift and a reminder of how much Maya had to lose if her fight against the Ashfords destroyed her reputation in their small community. People like Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Park, and Professor Williams believed in Maya because they'd observed her character over time. But a civil lawsuit and a potential bankruptcy would create a public record that might override their personal knowledge of who she really was. Maya spent that night lying awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a path forward that didn't end with Jessica in foster care and her own dreams abandoned. The lawsuit papers lay on the kitchen table like a ticking bomb, counting down toward a court date that would arrive whether Maya was prepared for it or not. She had no lawyer, no money for legal fees, and no clear understanding of how to defend herself against people who seemed to hold all the advantages in a system designed to favor wealth and influence over truth and justice.
But somewhere in the back of Maya's mind, a small flame of anger was beginning to burn alongside her fear. The Ashford family had made a fundamental miscalculation in targeting someone who had already survived the loss of her parents, the responsibility of raising her teenage sister, and 3 years of financial struggle while pursuing her education. Maya had been tested by circumstances that would have broken many people, and she had emerged stronger rather than bitter, more determined rather than defeated. The anger wasn't the destructive kind that leads to poor decisions and escalating conflicts. It was the focused anger of someone who had been pushed too far, someone who was finally ready to stop accepting blame for things she hadn't done and start fighting for the life she'd worked so hard to build. Maya Chen was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose except the truth, and who decides that the truth is worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning in late December, nearly 6 weeks after the accident, when Chloe Ashford made the mistake that would ultimately unravel their family's carefully constructed deception. She was sitting in her BMW in the parking lot of Valley State University, arguing with her boyfriend Tyler Morrison over the phone about their plans for New Year's Eve, when she mentioned something that would have been insignificant to anyone else listening. But Tyler Morrison happened to be the younger brother of James Morrison, the mysterious witness whose statement had been crucial to establishing Maya's fault in the accident. "I can't believe your brother actually went through with it," Chloe said, unaware that her phone conversation was being overheard by another student, Rachel Kim, who was walking past her car. "I mean, I know my dad promised him that consulting job, but lying to the police? That's pretty serious." Rachel Kim was a journalism major who had developed the habit of paying attention to conversations that sounded like they might contain newsworthy information. She stopped walking and pretended to check her phone while listening to Chloe's side of the conversation, her reporter's instincts activated by the mention of lying to police. "Yeah, but it's not like that girl can prove anything. And honestly, she should have been more careful. Just because she didn't actually cause the accident doesn't mean she couldn't have." Rachel Kim felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. She was listening to what sounded like a confession to insurance fraud, possibly involving perjury and witness tampering. Rachel had been looking for a significant story for her investigative journalism class, and this conversation suggested she might have stumbled onto something much bigger than a typical student project.
Rachel waited until Chloe ended her call and drove away before she pulled out her phone and made detailed notes about everything she'd overheard. Then she went to the university library and began researching recent traffic accidents in the area, using newspaper archives and police report databases that were accessible through the journalism department's research resources. It didn't take long for Rachel to find Maya Chen's case, a disputed intersection accident where a nursing student had been blamed for a collision with a prominent local family's vehicle. The police report was available through public records requests, and Rachel was struck by how thin the evidence against Maya appeared to be, consisting mainly of witness statements from the Ashford family and one additional witness named James Morrison. Rachel spent the next 2 days researching the Morrison family and discovering that James Morrison worked as a freelance consultant for various local businesses, exactly the type of person who might be influenced by the promise of future work with a successful law firm like Ashford and Associates. She also discovered that Tyler Morrison, James's younger brother, had been dating Chloe Ashford for 8 months, a relationship that created obvious opportunities for coordination between the families. On Saturday morning, Rachel drove to the Daily Grind coffee shop and interviewed Maria Santos about the night of November 15th. Maria confirmed that the shop had been closed at the time of the accident and that their parking lot would have been empty, making it impossible for anyone to have witnessed the collision from that location. Maria also agreed to provide Rachel with receipts and security camera footage that would prove the timeline of the shop's closure. Rachel's next step was to contact Maya Chen directly, using the phone number she'd found in the public records associated with the lawsuit. Maya was initially reluctant to speak with
journalism students about her case, but Rachel's description of Chloe's overheard phone conversation convinced Maya to meet with her at a neutral location, the university library where Rachel conducted much of her research. Maya listened with growing amazement as Rachel described what she'd uncovered about the Morrison family connection and the impossibility of James Morrison's witness statement. For the first time since the accident, Maya felt like someone else understood that she was the victim of a deliberate deception rather than the perpetrator of a traffic violation. "This is exactly what I needed," Maya said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. I couldn't understand why everyone was so certain I was lying." Rachel explained that she wanted to continue investigating the case as part of her journalism project, but she also wanted to help Maya find legal representation that could use the evidence Rachel was uncovering. Rachel's faculty advisor, Professor David Chen, no relation to Maya, was a former newspaper investigative reporter who maintained contacts with attorneys who specialized in insurance fraud and civil rights violations. Professor Chen reviewed Rachel's preliminary findings and immediately recognized the significance of what his student had discovered. Insurance fraud cases involving witness tampering and coordinated false statements often revealed broader patterns of corruption and abuse of power, particularly when they involved wealthy families with established community influence. "This is a serious criminal matter," Professor Chen told Rachel and Maya when they met in his office the following Monday. "If the Ashford family orchestrated false witness statements to defraud both Maya's insurance company and Maya herself, they've committed multiple felonies that could result in prison time." Professor Chen contacted his former colleague, civil rights attorney Lisa Rodriguez, who had built her career representing individuals who were victimized by people with greater resources and political connections. Lisa agreed to review Maya's case pro bono after Professor Chen explained the circumstances and the evidence Rachel had uncovered. Lisa Rodriguez was a formidable woman in her 40s who had grown up in a working-class family and understood the dynamics of power that allowed wealthy people to victimize those with fewer resources. She'd won several significant settlements against insurance companies and had developed a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys considered too risky or unprofitable to pursue. During their first meeting, Lisa listened to Maya's account of the accident and the subsequent pressure she had experienced from the Ashford family and their insurance companies.
Lisa took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about timeline, documentation, and potential witnesses that Maya might not have considered. Maya, what you're describing is a pattern of behavior that suggests this isn't the first time the Ashford family has used their influence to manipulate legal outcomes. People don't typically orchestrate this level of deception for a minor traffic accident unless they've had practice doing similar things before. Lisa's next step was to file a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, alleging that the initial investigation had been compromised by false witness statements and demanding that the case be reopened with proper scrutiny of James Morrison's claims. She also filed a motion with the civil court to stay the Ashford family's lawsuit against Maya, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation into their potentially fraudulent claims. The internal affairs investigation was assigned to Detective Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the police force who specialized in cases involving official misconduct and evidence tampering. Detective Mitchell had developed a reputation for thorough investigations that followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of the political implications or the influence of the people involved. Detective Mitchell's first step was to re-interview Officer Martinez, who had conducted the initial accident investigation. Officer Martinez admitted that she'd felt uncomfortable about some aspects of the case from the beginning, particularly the coordination between the Ashford family members' statements and the convenient appearance of James Morrison as a corroborating witness.
"I remember thinking their stories were a little too perfect," Officer Martinez told Detective Mitchell. "Most witnesses to accidents have different perspectives and remember different details, but the Ashford family statements were almost identical. It struck me as unusual, but I didn't have any concrete reason to question their credibility." Detective Mitchell then interviewed Maria Santos at the Daily Grind, confirming that the coffee shop had been closed during the time when James Morrison claimed to have witnessed the accident from their parking lot. Maria provided security camera footage that showed her locking up the shop at 6:15 p.m. on November 15th, more than an hour before the accident occurred. The most revealing interview was with James Morrison himself, who agreed to speak with Detective Mitchell without consulting an attorney, a decision that suggested he didn't fully understand the legal jeopardy he was facing. Morrison was clearly nervous during the interview, and his account of witnessing the accident contained several inconsistencies that hadn't been apparent in his original written statement. "Mr. Morrison, you stated that you saw the accident from the parking lot of the Daily Grind coffee shop," Detective Mitchell said, referring to her notes. "But we've confirmed that the shop was closed at the time of the accident. Can you explain how you were able to witness events from a location that would have been inaccessible?" Morrison's explanation was rambling and contradictory. He claimed he'd been walking past the closed shop when the accident occurred, then changed his story to say he'd been in his car near the parking lot, then finally admitted he might have been confused about his exact location. Detective Mitchell recognized the signs of someone whose prepared story was falling apart under scrutiny. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you directly. Did anyone encourage you to provide a witness statement about this accident? Did anyone offer you anything in exchange for your cooperation?" Morrison's eventual admission came in pieces, extracted through patient questioning and the presentation of evidence that contradicted his claims. He finally acknowledged that Robert Ashford had contacted him through Tyler's relationship with Chloe, and that Robert had suggested Morrison could be helpful to his law firm's consulting practice if he was willing to support their account of the accident. "He didn't exactly tell me to lie," he said, trying to minimize his complicity. "He just said it would be helpful if I could confirm what his family had witnessed, and that there might be future business opportunities if I was reliable." Detective Mitchell recognized this as a textbook example of witness tampering. Robert Ashford had been careful not to explicitly instruct Morrison to provide false testimony, but had created clear incentives for Morrison to support the family's version of events, whether or not it was truthful. The investigation took another significant turn when Detective Mitchell obtained a warrant to search the Ashford family's vehicles for any evidence that might shed light on the accident circumstances.
The search of Chloe's BMW revealed something that no one had expected to find: a small dash cam that had been installed behind the rearview mirror and had been recording continuously since the previous summer. The dashcam's memory card contained 90 minutes of footage from the night of the accident, including the crucial 17 minutes and 34 seconds that captured not only the collision itself, but the conversation between family members immediately afterwards as they coordinated their story before the police arrived. Detective Mitchell watched the footage in her office with Lisa Rodriguez and Maya present as witnesses to its contents. The video quality was excellent, providing a clear view of the intersection and the traffic signals during the time leading up to the accident. What they saw contradicted every aspect of the Ashford family's official account. The traffic light was clearly green in Maya's direction when she entered the intersection and had been green for several seconds before the collision occurred. Chloe Ashford had run a red light while talking on her cell phone, apparently distracted by her conversation and unaware that the light had changed. The impact occurred when Chloe's BMW struck Maya's Honda on the driver's side, exactly the damage pattern that Officer Martinez had noticed but hadn't been able to explain under the official version of events.
But even more damning than the footage of the accident itself was the audio recording of the conversation that followed, as the Ashford family quickly agreed on a version of events that would shift blame to Maya. The recording captured Victoria Ashford saying, "We need to make sure this doesn't affect Chloe's insurance rates or her driving record. That girl doesn't look like she has the resources to fight us." Robert Ashford could be heard instructing his family to stay consistent with our story and discussing how to find someone who can corroborate our account. The recording captured him making a phone call to James Morrison, though only Robert's side of the conversation was audible. "Jimmy, we have a situation that requires your help. Can you meet us at the scene and provide a witness statement?" Maya watched the footage with tears streaming down her face. Tears of vindication, relief, and anger at everything she'd been put through over the past 6 weeks. The dashcam had captured irrefutable proof that she'd been telling the truth all along, and that the Ashford family had orchestrated an elaborate fraud to avoid responsibility for their daughter's mistake. "This changes everything," Lisa Rodriguez said as the video ended. "We're not just talking about insurance fraud anymore. This is criminal conspiracy, witness tampering, perjury, and possibly extortion. The Ashford family is going to face serious federal charges." Detective Mitchell immediately contacted the district attorney's office and the FBI's white-collar crime division, recognizing that the evidence suggested a pattern of criminal behavior that extended beyond a single traffic accident. The dashcam footage would become the centerpiece of a federal investigation into the Ashford family's business practices and their history of using their influence to manipulate legal outcomes. Maya felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion as she realized her ordeal was finally coming to an end, but was also beginning to understand that the Ashford family's downfall would likely become a major news story that would thrust her into an uncomfortable spotlight. She'd fought for the truth not because she wanted attention, but because she'd had no choice except to defend herself and protect Jessica's future. Now, she was about to become the face of a scandal that would expose corruption at the highest levels of her community's power structure. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in January when Rachel Kim's investigative article was published simultaneously in the university newspaper and picked up by the regional daily paper that served the entire metropolitan area. The headline read, "Dashcam footage exposes insurance fraud conspiracy by prominent local family." And within hours, the story had been shared across social media platforms and picked up by television news stations throughout the state. Maya Chen woke up that morning to find 17 missed calls on her phone and a crowd of reporters camped outside her apartment building. The quiet nursing student who had simply been trying to get to her sister's violin lesson 2 months earlier was suddenly the central figure in a story that was capturing national attention as an example of how wealth and influence could be used to victimize ordinary people.
The first television interview was conducted by Channel 7 investigative reporter Amanda Walsh, who met with Maya at the hospital where she worked, a neutral location that emphasized Maya's dedication to healthcare and community service, rather than focusing solely on her role as a victim. Maya was nervous about appearing on camera, but Dr. James Park and several of her nursing colleagues had encouraged her to tell her story publicly, arguing that her experience could help other people who might be facing similar situations. "I never wanted to be in the news," Maya told Amanda Walsh during the interview. "I just wanted to clear my name and protect my sister's future. But if my story can help other people understand how to fight back when someone tries to take advantage of them, then maybe some good can come from all of this." The interview aired during the evening news and was rebroadcast nationally on several cable news networks. Maya's quiet dignity and obvious sincerity created a stark contrast with the Ashford family's arrogance and sense of entitlement, making her a sympathetic figure who represented the struggles of working families trying to build better lives for themselves.
The legal consequences for the Ashford family unfolded rapidly once the dashcam footage became public evidence. Robert Ashford was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, witness tampering, and perjury, with additional federal charges pending related to his use of his law license to facilitate criminal activities. Victoria Ashford faced similar charges related to her role in coordinating the false witness statements, while Chloe was charged with filing a false police report and insurance fraud. James Morrison agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about how Robert Ashford had recruited him to provide false witness statements and promised him future business opportunities in exchange for his cooperation. Morrison's testimony revealed that this wasn't the first time Robert Ashford had used similar tactics to manipulate legal outcomes for his clients and his own family. The FBI's investigation expanded to include several other cases where the Ashford family had been involved in suspicious insurance claims and legal settlements, revealing a pattern of behavior that stretched back more than a decade. Federal investigators discovered evidence that Robert Ashford had used his law firm as a vehicle for coordinating fraudulent insurance claims, witness tampering, and other white-collar crimes that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Maya's own lawsuit against the Ashford family was settled within 2 weeks of the dashcam footage becoming public, with the family agreeing to pay her $250,000 in damages for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and legal expenses. The settlement was actually smaller than what Lisa Rodriguez believed Maya could have won at trial, but Maya chose to accept it because she wanted to move forward with her life rather than spending months in court reliving the trauma of the experience. The financial settlement meant that Maya could finally afford to complete her nursing education without worrying about supporting Jessica through part-time jobs and double shifts at the hospital. For the first time in 3 years, Maya could focus on her studies and her future career rather than constantly calculating expenses and worrying about making ends meet. Jessica's reaction to her sister's vindication was a mixture of pride and relief that the stress and uncertainty of the past 2 months was finally over. "I always knew you were telling the truth," Jessica told Maya the night after the settlement was announced. "I just didn't understand why it was so hard for other people to believe you." The community response to Maya's story was overwhelmingly supportive, with dozens of people reaching out to offer encouragement, assistance, and their own stories of being victimized by people with greater resources and influence. Mrs. Patterson organized a benefit concert featuring Jessica and several of her other violin students, raising additional money for Maya's education and highlighting the importance of supporting young people who were working to improve their circumstances through dedication and hard work. Dr. James Park used Maya's case as an example in his medical ethics classes, discussing how healthcare professionals have responsibilities to advocate for vulnerable patients and community members who might not have the resources to protect themselves from exploitation. Maya's experience became a teaching tool that helped other nursing students understand the broader social justice implications of their chosen profession.
Professor Catherine Williams incorporated Maya's story into her nursing leadership curriculum, using it to illustrate how individual integrity and perseverance could challenge systemic inequalities and create positive changes that benefited entire communities. Maya's willingness to fight for the truth, despite overwhelming odds, became an inspiration to other students who were facing their own challenges while pursuing their education. The legal reforms that emerged from Maya's case included new requirements for insurance companies to conduct more thorough investigations of suspicious claims, particularly those involving high-value settlements where witness statements were the primary evidence. The state legislature passed new penalties for witness tampering in insurance fraud cases, and law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for investigating accidents where there were potential conflicts of interest among witnesses. Officer Martinez used the experience as a learning opportunity that made her a more effective accident investigator, developing new techniques for identifying potentially fraudulent witness statements and recognizing the warning signs that suggested deeper investigation might be needed. She began teaching training seminars for other officers about insurance fraud detection, using Maya's case as a primary example of how careful observation and follow-up investigation could uncover complex criminal conspiracies.
Detective Sarah Mitchell's investigation of Maya's case led to her promotion to the White-Collar Crime Division, where she specialized in cases involving insurance fraud and public corruption. The techniques she developed while investigating the Ashford family became standard procedures that helped law enforcement agencies throughout the region identify and prosecute similar crimes. Rachel Kim's investigative reporting earned her several journalism awards and led to a summer internship at a major metropolitan newspaper, where she continued to focus on stories about ordinary people fighting against powerful interests. Her coverage of Maya's case became part of her portfolio when she applied for graduate school in investigative journalism, and she remained in contact with Maya to follow up on the long-term impacts of the story. Lisa Rodriguez used the publicity from Maya's case to launch a nonprofit legal aid organization that provided free representation to individuals who were being victimized by insurance fraud and other white-collar crimes. The organization received funding from several major foundations and was able to help dozens of other people who found themselves in situations similar to Maya's, lacking the resources to challenge wealthy opponents who were trying to exploit them. 6 months after the settlement, Maya graduated from nursing school with honors and accepted a position as a pediatric nurse at Mercy General Hospital, the same institution where she'd worked as a student and discovered her passion for caring for young patients. Her starting salary was enough to provide a comfortable life for Jessica and herself, including a 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood and the ability to save money for Jessica's college education. Jessica continued her violin studies with Mrs. Patterson and was accepted into the State University's pre-med program with a full scholarship that covered tuition, room, and board. She planned to become a pediatric surgeon, inspired by her sister's example of using professional skills to help vulnerable people and make positive changes in their community. Maya used part of her settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for nursing students who were supporting family members while pursuing their education. The Maya Chin Scholarship provided financial assistance to students who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to caring for others, particularly those who had overcome significant personal challenges to pursue their education. A year after the accident, Maya was invited to speak at the State Nursing Association's annual conference about her experience and the importance of advocating for truth and justice even when facing overwhelming odds. Her presentation focused not on the legal aspects of her case, but on the personal qualities that had sustained her through the ordeal: integrity, perseverance, and the support of people who believed in her character even when official systems seemed to be working against her. "I learned that truth isn't always enough by itself," Maya told the audience of nursing professionals. "Sometimes you have to fight for truth, and sometimes you have to accept help from unexpected places. But I also learned that when you stand up for what's right, other people will stand with you, and together you can change things that seem impossible to change alone. The Ashford family's downfall had broader implications for their community's power structure, as the FBI's investigation revealed connections between their criminal activities and several other prominent families and businesses. Robert Ashford was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, while Victoria received 5 years and Chloe was sentenced to 2 years of probation and community service. The law firm of Ashford and Associates was dissolved, and Robert's legal license was permanently revoked. The family was forced to sell their properties and luxury vehicles to pay legal fees and restitution, experiencing the kind of financial devastation they had tried to inflict on Maya. The irony was not lost on community observers, who noted that the family's attempt to avoid responsibility for a minor traffic accident had ultimately cost them everything they had worked to build over decades. 2 years after the accident, Maya was promoted to charge nurse in the pediatric unit at Mercy General Hospital, a position that allowed her to mentor newer nurses and help establish policies that protected both patients and healthcare workers from exploitation and abuse. She used her experience with the legal system to advocate for hospital employees who faced wrongful termination, harassment, or other forms of workplace injustice.
Maya also became a frequent speaker at conferences and workshops for young professionals, particularly women from working-class backgrounds who were trying to advance their careers while supporting family members. Her message was always the same: integrity and perseverance could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, but success required not just individual effort, but also the willingness to build supportive communities and help others facing similar challenges. The intersection of Maple and 3rd was eventually redesigned with new traffic signals and improved visibility, partly as a result of the attention Maya's case had brought to the dangerous conditions that existed there. City traffic engineer Linda Walsh finally received approval for the safety improvements she'd been requesting for years, and the intersection became a model for other similar projects throughout the city. Mrs. Patterson continued teaching violin lessons in her studio, but she also began offering free lessons to children from low-income families, using donations from community members who had been inspired by Maya and Jessica's story. The benefit concert she'd organized for Maya became an annual event that raised money for scholarships and music education programs throughout the community. Dr. James Park established a medical ethics research center at the hospital, focusing on issues related to healthcare advocacy and social justice. Maya served on the center's advisory board, helping to develop programs that trained healthcare professionals to recognize and respond to situations where patients or colleagues might be facing exploitation or abuse. The Daily Grind coffee shop became an unofficial meeting place for community activists and social justice advocates, with Maria Santos hosting regular discussion groups about local issues and organizing volunteer efforts to help families facing economic hardship. The shop's role in exposing the Ashford family's fraud had made it a symbol of how ordinary businesses and citizens could play important roles in maintaining community integrity and accountability. 3 years after the accident, Maya married Carlos Martinez, her former nursing school study partner, who had become a nurse practitioner specializing in community health. Their wedding was a small ceremony held in the hospital chapel, attended by the extended family of colleagues, mentors, and friends who had supported Maya through her ordeal and celebrated her success in building the life she'd always dreamed of creating. Jessica served as Maya's maid of honor and performed a violin solo during the ceremony, playing the same Bach piece she'd been practicing on the night of the accident. The music that had once provided a soundtrack to crisis now marked a celebration of resilience, growth, and the power of love and community to overcome even the most challenging circumstances.
5 years later, Maya Chen Martinez stood at the podium of the National Conference on Healthcare Advocacy, looking out at an audience of 800 nursing professionals, social workers, and community health advocates who had gathered to hear her keynote address about transforming personal trauma into systemic change. The conference was being held in Chicago, and through the convention center's floor-to-ceiling windows, Maya could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, a view that reminded her of possibilities extending beyond immediate circumstances, the same perspective that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her legal battle. 7 years ago, I was a 23-year-old nursing student who thought justice was something that happened automatically when you told the truth, Maya began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced the anxious uncertainty of her younger self. I learned the hard way that truth is just the beginning of justice, not its conclusion. What matters is what you do with truth once you discover it, and whether you're willing to fight for it even when the odds seem impossible. In the audience, Dr. James Park smiled with the pride of a mentor, watching her former student address issues that had once seemed too large for any individual to tackle. Now in his early 50s and serving as chief medical officer at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Park had incorporated Maya's story into the orientation program for new medical residents, using her experience to illustrate how healthcare professionals could advocate for vulnerable patients and colleagues who might not have the resources to protect themselves.
Also in the audience was Rachel Kim, now an investigative reporter for The Washington Post, who was covering the conference as part of a series about grassroots healthcare reform movements. Rachel's career had been launched by her coverage of Maya's case, and she had continued to focus on stories about ordinary people challenging powerful interests and creating positive social change. Her recent Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting had recognized her work exposing corruption in the pharmaceutical industry, but she credited Maya's case with teaching her how individual integrity could serve as a catalyst for broader systemic reforms. The dashcam footage that exonerated me was just technology, Maya continued, but the investigation that uncovered it required human beings who were willing to look beyond the official story and ask uncomfortable questions. It required people, like the journalism student who overheard a conversation and decided to investigate further, the police detective who was willing to reopen a closed case, and the lawyer who took on a client with no money but a strong commitment to truth. Maya's presentation focused on the healthcare advocacy center she had established at Mercy General Hospital, which had become a national model for programs that trained medical professionals to recognize and respond to situations where patients faced exploitation, abuse, or discrimination. The center had helped hundreds of patients navigate complex insurance disputes, challenge wrongful medical billing, and access legal representation when their rights were violated by healthcare systems or insurance companies. The program had grown beyond its original focus on individual patient advocacy to include policy research and legislative lobbying efforts that had resulted in new state and federal protections for patients and healthcare workers. Maya's team had successfully advocated for laws requiring hospitals to provide patient advocates for all emergency room visits, mandatory reporting of suspicious insurance claim denials, and enhanced penalties for healthcare fraud that targeted vulnerable populations. Jessica Chen, now a third-year medical student at Northwestern University, watched her sister's presentation via live stream from her apartment in Evanston. Jessica's path to medical school had been supported by the scholarship fund Maya had established, and she was specializing in pediatric surgery with plans to work in underserved communities where her skills could have the greatest impact. Jessica had inherited Maya's quiet determination and their parents' commitment to using professional success as a platform for helping others. The violin that had once been Jessica's primary passion now served as a therapeutic tool in her volunteer work with hospitalized children, where she played concerts in pediatric wards and taught music to young patients as part of their recovery process.
Jessica's medical school thesis focused on the healing power of music therapy in trauma recovery, research that had been inspired by watching how her own violin practice had provided emotional stability during the difficult months following Maya's accident. Mrs. Patterson, now 82 and still teaching violin lessons 3 days a week, had established a music therapy program at Mercy General Hospital that brought volunteer musicians to patient rooms and waiting areas throughout the facility. The program had been funded partly by donations from Maya's scholarship fund and had become so successful that it had been replicated at hospitals throughout the region. Mrs. Patterson often told people that Maya and Jessica's story had taught her that music was not just an art form, but a tool for healing and community building. Lisa Rodriguez, the civil rights attorney who had represented Maya pro bono, had used the publicity from the case to establish one of the most successful legal aid organizations in the state, providing free representation to individuals facing insurance fraud, employment discrimination, and other civil rights violations. The organization had handled more than 2,000 cases in its 5 years of operation, with a success rate that had attracted support from major foundations and corporate sponsors who recognized the importance of leveling the playing field for people without resources to challenge more powerful opponents. Lisa's organization had also become a training ground for young lawyers who wanted to specialize in social justice advocacy, offering fellowships and mentorship programs that had placed dozens of attorneys in legal aid organizations, public defender offices, and civil rights groups throughout the country. Maya served on the organization's board of directors and frequently spoke at legal conferences about the importance of providing accessible representation to people facing systemic discrimination or exploitation.
Detective Sarah Mitchell, now a lieutenant in the white-collar crime division of the state police, had used the investigative techniques she developed in Maya's case to uncover several major insurance fraud conspiracies that had netted millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. Her work had led to the prosecution of more than 50 individuals and organizations involved in various schemes to defraud insurance companies and individual policyholders, and she had become a nationally recognized expert in insurance fraud detection and investigation. Lieutenant Mitchell frequently testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger penalties for insurance fraud and witness tampering, using Maya's case as an example of how these crimes could devastate innocent individuals and families. Her advocacy had contributed to new state and federal laws that increased criminal penalties for insurance fraud and provided additional resources for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. Officer Martinez, who had conducted the original accident investigation, had been promoted to detective and specialized in traffic accident reconstruction, using advanced forensic techniques to investigate suspicious crashes and identify cases where witness statements might be fabricated or manipulated. She had become an expert in using technology like dashcam footage, cell phone data, and traffic camera recordings to establish accurate timelines and determine fault in complex accident cases. Detective Martinez's expertise had been crucial in solving several high-profile cases where wealthy defendants had attempted to manipulate accident investigations through false witness statements or evidence tampering. She often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of thorough accident investigation and the warning signs that might indicate insurance fraud or witness tampering.
Carlos entered Maya's office carrying 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they'd maintained throughout their 7 years of marriage. He now served as director of community health programs for the city, overseeing initiatives that addressed healthcare disparities and social determinants of health in underserved neighborhoods. Their partnership extended beyond their personal relationship to encompass shared professional goals of creating more equitable healthcare systems for vulnerable populations. The Senate hearing is scheduled for next month, Carlos said, settling into the chair across from Maya's desk. Senator Williams wants you to be the lead witness for the patient advocacy provisions. Maya nodded, reviewing the legislative briefing materials that would form the basis of her testimony. The proposed law represented the culmination of a decade of advocacy work that had begun with her own victimization by insurance fraud and evolved into a comprehensive effort to protect all patients from similar exploitation. Through the windows of her office, Maya could see the busy street below, where people were heading to work, school, and medical appointments, many of them unaware of how vulnerable they might be to the kind of systematic deception that had nearly destroyed her own life. The center she'd built served as a safety net for those who found themselves trapped in similar situations, but Maya's ultimate goal was to create systemic changes that would prevent such victimization from occurring in the first place. The morning brought its usual stream of consultations with families facing healthcare-related legal challenges. Maya met with a single mother whose insurance company was denying coverage for her child's cancer treatment, an elderly couple being pressured to accept blame for a medical error that had harmed the husband during surgery, and a nurse who was facing retaliation from her employer for reporting unsafe working conditions. Each case reminded Maya of her own experience with the Ashford family, the way powerful institutions and wealthy individuals could manipulate systems to their advantage while placing blame and financial burden on those least equipped to fight back. But Maya's center had developed sophisticated strategies for challenging these power imbalances, combining legal advocacy with media attention, policy reform, and community organizing to create multiple avenues for achieving justice. The afternoon brought the visit of Rachel Kim, now a senior investigative reporter whose work had exposed healthcare fraud schemes affecting millions of Americans. Rachel was working on a documentary about Maya's story and its broader implications for healthcare justice, exploring how individual cases of fraud and abuse could serve as catalysts for sweeping institutional reforms. What strikes me most about your story, Rachel said during our interview, is how it demonstrates that ordinary people can challenge the most powerful institutions when they refuse to accept injustice and build coalitions with others who share their values. Maya reflected on Rachel's observation as she prepared for her evening presentation to a group of nursing students at the local university, young women and men who reminded her of herself a decade earlier, full of idealism about healing and helping others, but not yet aware of how complex those goals could become in a system that didn't always reward integrity and compassion. The dashcam that saved my case was just technology, Maya told the nursing students during her presentation. But technology doesn't seek truth. People do. And people don't fight for justice in isolation. They build movements that can challenge systems and create lasting change. One student raised her hand to ask about the personal cost of Maya's advocacy work, the toll of spending years fighting against powerful opponents while building a career and maintaining family relationships. Maya answered honestly about the challenges and sacrifices, but also about the profound satisfaction of using personal trauma as a foundation for helping others avoid similar experiences. After the presentation, Maya drove home to the house she and Carlos had bought in a quiet neighborhood where Jessica had grown up, the same area where Mrs. Patterson still lived and continued teaching violin lessons to a new generation of students. Maya often reflected on how different her life might have been if the Ashford family had succeeded in their deception, if the dashcam footage had never been discovered, if people like Rachel, Dr. Park, and Lisa Rodriguez hadn't been willing to fight for truth and justice.
That evening, Maya and Carlos sat on their back porch reviewing the latest statistics from the Healthcare Advocacy Center. Thousands of patients helped, millions of dollars in fraudulent claims prevented, dozens of policy reforms enacted. But beyond the numbers, Maya thought about the individual stories. Families who had avoided bankruptcy, patients who had received necessary medical care, healthcare workers who had been protected from retaliation for speaking truth. As Maya prepared for sleep, she received a text from Mrs. Patterson, now 85 and still teaching violin 3 mornings a week. The message included a video of her newest student, a 7-year-old girl playing a simple melody with the same concentration and joy that Jessica had shown years earlier.
The music served as a reminder that beauty and hope could emerge from the most challenging circumstances, and that individual acts of courage and kindness could create ripple effects that transformed entire communities. Maya's final reflection before sleep was about the intersection of Maple and 3rd, which had been redesigned with modern traffic signals and safety features that had prevented dozens of accidents over the past decade. But more importantly, that intersection had become a symbol in their community of how ordinary people could challenge powerful interests and create positive change that benefited everyone. The dashcam that had captured 17 minutes and 34 seconds of fraud and conspiracy had ultimately generated decades of advocacy work that protected vulnerable patients and families throughout the healthcare system. Maya's story proved that technology was just a tool. What mattered was the courage of people willing to fight for truth, the intelligence of those who could investigate complex deceptions, and the persistence of communities committed to justice and equity for all. Thank you for following Maya's incredible journey from victim to advocate, from a frightened nursing student to a national leader in healthcare justice. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more tales of ordinary people fighting extraordinary battles against powerful interests, please subscribe to stay updated on new stories that explore courage, justice, and the power of truth to transform communities. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of readers who believe that individual integrity can create systemic change, and that every person's story has the power to inspire others to stand up for what's right. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth stories about real people making real differences in their communities and beyond. Subscribe now and never miss a story that proves truth, persistence, and community action can overcome even the most daunting challenges.